The world's newest country has already erupted in what some are calling a civil war. 2 years after its birth, the rivalry between South Sudan's president and now former vice president has led to thousands of deaths. What caused this conflict? Is there an end in sight? And what are the implications on South Sudan, the region, and the world? Find out next on The Line. This is On The Line, and I'm Aisha Tanzim. In the last 1 month of fighting in South Sudan, the International Crisis Group estimates the death toll to be close to 10,000. The UN estimates people displaced from their homes to be over 350,000. This violence is a result of political rivalry between President Salva Kiir and his former deputy Riek Machar. Our guests will explain how it all started, why is it so volatile, and where is it headed. So let's meet them. Dr. Peter Pham is the director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and Andrew Green is the Juba Bureau Chief of the South Sudan Project. Welcome to On The Line. Starting with you, Andrew, tell us briefly how it started.
Well, in July, President Salva Kiir fired his entire cabinet, including the Vice President Riek Machar, who is a leader of one of the other major ethnic groups in South Sudan. And Dr. Machar at the time said he was going to go peacefully, but has and didn't cause a lot of problems initially. But then fighting broke out in mid-December. Kiir accused Machar of leading a coup attempt. Whether he did or not is unclear, but it quickly divided along ethnic lines and is now spreading across the country, and is just taking advantage of a lot of political tensions in the country.
Now, Dr. Pham, our Africa audience probably understand this much better, but we have audience in other parts of the world. So please explain. South Sudan is very ethnically diverse. President Kiir is member of Dinka, and Dr. Machar is a member of Nuer. Are these the only two groups fighting, or are there other groups fighting as well?
Well, two things, Aisha. First, as you mentioned, South Sudan is very ethnically diverse. There are over 60 ethnic groups which share this territory, and no two of them, even the two largest put together, constitute a majority. Now, the largest group are the Dinka, which President Kiir belongs to, and the second largest are the Nuer, the former Vice President Riek Machar. But together they don't constitute a majority even. But it's very important to keep in mind that although there have been some ethnic dimensions to this conflict, this is primarily a conflict between political leadership about the future direction and power in this country. For example, the founding father of South Sudan, the late Dr. John Garang, was a Dinka. His widow, Rebecca Garang, was arrested by President Salva Kiir. His son, Mabior, is heading the so-called rebel delegation to the peace talks in Addis Ababa. On the other hand, the foreign minister of South Sudan, Mariel Benjamin, is a Nuer, but he's serving with Salva Kiir. And then you have one of the arrested prisoners, high-level prisoners, Pagan Amun, the former Secretary General of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the ruling party, and he's a member of yet another ethnic group, the Shilluk. So this is a very complex tapestry that we have to bear in mind that shouldn't be simplified to simply ethnic tension.
Okay, so Andrew, while it's so complicated, do people see an end in sight, or do you fear that this might drag on as previous conflicts in South Sudan have dragged on for years?
I don't know that there is a clear end in sight right now. Both sides are talking, but have not reached a clear even idea of what issues or when the discussion is going to start and what the preconditions are going to be for those negotiations. I also don't know how you necessarily bring the country back together when you have, as Dr. Pham was saying, so many rival political factions who want to achieve power. What kind of coalition government are they going to be able to form that's going to appease all the different groups that are involved?
So ethnic diversity is one element, but Dr. Pham, help us understand what makes South Sudan so volatile?
Well, a number of things. The southern part of what was once United Sudan has always suffered from political, economic marginalization and lack of development. And then the long civil war, which by some estimates cost up to 2 million lives, predominantly in the south, exercised a heavy toll. And so there really were no institutions. There wasn't even a city Juba, where the capital was. There was a garrison and a village. And so you literally started, and I remember President Salva Kiir said this to me a couple years ago, before independence, we're starting from ground zero. And he was absolutely right. This is state building from the ground up. And because there was a transition period between 2005 and 2011 where the referendum for independence had not yet taken place, and the international community didn't want to prejudice the referendum, although I think one could have guessed how Southern Sudanese would have voted. A lot of efforts were meant at that time to rather support the national unity government in Khartoum rather than building up separate institutions in Juba. And so when the referendum took place in January 2011, just 6 months before independence, it was a lot of catch-up, and unfortunately many of the institutions weren't built. And in the subsequent 2.5 years, we've seen a lot of power struggles, a great deal of corruption. Just a year ago, President Salva Kiir wrote a rather plaintive letter begging 75 officials of his own government to please give back $4 billion that they had stolen.
Because he didn't have power over them, or because they were from rival ethnic groups? Is that what's going on here?
They had divvied it up, and now they were short of cash and needed money, and so he was begging them to return some of it.
Okay, now, Andrew, another element to this is the oil in the region. South Sudan seems to have most of the oil. Sudan seems to have most of the refineries and the pipeline to the Red Sea. They've had tensions until mid-last year. How's that playing out?
Well, President Omar Bashir of Sudan actually came and visited President Kiir in South Sudan, and they had an agreement. They've apparently reached some kind of agreement that they're going to have a team that's going to go make sure that the oil is still being produced, at least in Upper Nile State. In Unity State, the other oil-producing state, it's already been shut down. But I think there are serious concerns that the rebels may have destroyed some of the oil production equipment, that it's sitting right now not being used, and that might create further damage. I imagine President Bashir is probably worried about this because it represents a major amount of money that coming into his country.
Dr. Pham?
I would just add to complicate this picture even further, but to give it some of the flavor, most of the oil sits in areas, Upper Nile and Unity State, which are the traditional home territories of ethnic groups other than the Dinka, who predominate, again, this is not an ethnic conflict, but predominate the government in Juba. So that adds another dimension to it that some of the rebels are resenting. It's the oil under their feet, but the revenues are accruing and being stolen by a different ethnic group, or at least group that has marginalized them.
Do you think, Andrew, that South Sudanese are moving towards an identity as South Sudanese, or are the tribal or ethnic identities dominating, and that's what's leading to the conflict?
Well, I think that it is complicated. I think initially there was a lot of unity that developed around the idea of independence. Even up until the second independence anniversary in July of this past year, people were still very excited. They understand that a lot of development hasn't taken place. They're missing a lot of resources still, but that there's still this sense of national identity that we are South Sudanese and we've gained independence. But at the same time, when President Kiir did sack the cabinet, became clear, there were tensions already in place, and that may have exacerbated them a little bit, which then helped lead to the current crisis.
Help me understand how the region is impacted. The three mediating countries, that's Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan, what stakes do they have here, and who else has stakes here?
Well, certainly, as Andrew mentioned, Sudan certainly has a stake because without the oil revenue, which is a considerable part of that country's foreign exchange, and they're already suffering a crisis. A couple of months ago, there were riots in Khartoum over increases in prices of basic goods and commodities. So the government there is in desperate straits. The shutdown of the oil the year before, due to a conflict between South Sudan and Sudan, really impacted the situation in the north. So Sudan wants the oil to flow and would like, if possible, I think the subtext is to control that flow. Kenya has a lot of investments. There are a lot of Kenyans doing business in South Sudan. Kenyan banks are a major part of the financial sector there. Ethiopia certainly has the least interest in so far as direct material interest, but certainly has long memories of the Second Sudanese Civil War, which drove hundreds of thousands of refugees into Ethiopia and aggravated situations there along its borders, so it certainly seeks stability. And then one other country that we ought to mention is Uganda, which has long been a supporter of the SPLM, the main liberation movement political party in the South, and which is currently in the current fight backing the government of President Salva Kiir. Ugandan troops have deployed to South Sudan. In fact, there's some controversy in the Ugandan parliament whether that was done constitutionally. The government is officially saying that they're there to help evacuate Ugandan citizens, but there are credible reports from the field that they're being used to fight alongside South Sudanese government forces against the rebels.
We have to take a short break here, but when we come back, we'll talk about the human cost of this war. Stay with us.
Voice of America. 1,500 hours
of news and information.
Educational and cultural programming.
To more than 134 million people
worldwide each week.
Listen to us on radio.
Watch us on television.
Follow us on Facebook or Twitter.
And through your mobile device.
VOA.
We're dynamic
and consistent
in bringing you
the most reliable information in 43 languages.
Tune in.
Tune in.
Welcome back to On the Line. I'm Aisha Tanseem. We are talking about the violence and political turmoil in South Sudan. Our guests are Dr. Peter Pham, the director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and Andrew Green, the Juba bureau chief of the South Sudan Project. We're talking about the violence here. Obviously, violence leads to human costs. Dr. Pham, what are we looking at here?
Well, we're looking at several thousand, if not up to 10,000 killed in just 1 month, well over 350,000 displaced, and we're seeing daily tragedies like just this past week, several hundred people who were on a barge trying to get away from the fighting. The barge capsized and they drowned. So small vignettes like that as well. And there's the risk, of course, of refugee flows into neighboring countries, primarily Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda.
Expand on that, Andrew, because we hear from international human rights organizations and also from international aid organizations that delivering aid, food, medical supplies is becoming more and more difficult.
I would imagine that's the case. And again, we're hearing that at least 2,000 to 3,000 people are crossing the border every day into the 3 countries that Dr. Pham mentioned. And it's going to be, they've got to set up sites for them. Those places don't exist where they're going to stay. They've got to get emergency rations to people and emergency tents or plastic sheeting so people can build houses. And all of that takes time, and this has all happened so quickly. You're seeing a lot of people who are just sleeping out in the open, that don't have enough food, especially women and children. The UN is reporting that a lot of children are traveling on their own without parents and ending up in refugee camps across the borders.
Is there any fear of the crops and what's happening to the crops at this time because of the fighting?
I mean, this would be the traditional time where some crops are being harvested. The planting has already taken place. So who's going to be on the ground to do it? Is it being destroyed in the fighting? There are already concerns about food shortages in South Sudan anyway because of heavy rains that cause flooding in some areas, in some of the same areas where the fighting is being reported. So again, we could be looking at severe food shortages again next year.
Dr. Pham, is it similar to past conflicts in South Sudan, although past conflicts were mostly with the joint Sudan, or is there something different about this one?
Well, a little of both, if you don't mind. On one hand, although we tend to focus outside Sudan and South Sudan on the north-south dimension of the Second Sudanese Civil War from 1982 to the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Accords in January of 2005, during much of that period, there was actually not only the fighting between the North and the South, but also fighting within the South and ever-switching alliances. And many of these memories of atrocities past, betrayals past, switching sides, they color perceptions of reality today and certainly influence the decision makers as they look at potential partners or enemies. And so we can't underestimate the influence of that on the current situation.
And there was another element of not this fighting, but fighting in South Sudan, and that was for cattle herding. Can you tell us, Andrew, if that is going to be looped into this war and become a bigger fight, or that's going to remain a separate feud?
Well, there are always concerns about the rebel groups that already existed internally in South Sudan and whether they're going to join one of the sides now. And then also there is ongoing interethnic conflict between neighboring communities who fight each other for resources. There's no reason, if there are food shortages again, then there's no reason to think that that wouldn't happen again in the coming dry season. And that's got to be a concern for the international community and the government.
So we talked about the region, but the international community is worried. The oil supply has also got China worried, and China usually doesn't interfere in these kinds of events. Dr. Pham, how's that playing out?
Well, certainly China has a stake in the continuing flow of oil, not just because pre-independence of South Sudan, China was awarded some very lucrative oil blocks along the disputed border, but also because China invested heavily billions of dollars in building the pipeline infrastructure to take the oil out to market. So the Chinese Special Envoy for Africa, Ambassador Zhang Xinhua, has been on the sidelines in Addis Ababa helping try to move the negotiations along. However, I think like his U.S. counterpart, the Special Envoy for Sudan, South Sudan, Ambassador Donald Booth, these international envoys have a limited leverage. They can cajole, try and push, but a lot of it, South Sudanese leaders on both sides of the fighting have somewhat become inured to criticism and pressure from abroad. They've gotten used to being given a free pass, especially those in the government of Salva Kiir, free pass. The U.S. has not been as critical and challenging perhaps as we ought to have been when there are abuses of human rights, increasing authoritarianism, even journalists attacked or in one notable case killed. And so they're used to getting away with things, and now we have to disabuse them of that notion, I think.
Andrew, help us understand what's the U.S. stake in this conflict. Why is the U.S. involved so much, and what other players are involved?
The United States was very instrumental and supportive of South Sudan's push for independence, and I think has invested very heavily. There's a large U.S. embassy compound. There's large U.S. influence, USAID projects all over the country. A lot of taxpayer money is going to South Sudan's development. And to watch, after 2.5 years, the country start to fall apart has got to be causing a lot of worry in Washington and obviously in Juba on the ground. You also see large EU influence, and the United Nations also has a huge mission in South Sudan.
Dr. Pham, is the current U.S. administration looking at it as a legacy issue as well?
Well, I think it is. One of the achievements of the Obama administration with respect to policy in Africa was to shepherd that the comprehensive peace process, the transition process, to the conclusion very peacefully, actually, of the independence of South Sudan. It's a signal achievement, building, of course, on the legacy of work done under President George W. Bush, and even before that, interest in the Clinton administration. So this is an area, as Andrew has mentioned, the U.S. has invested more heavily in terms of development assistance and diplomatic capital and influence and effort and energy in the peace process between Sudan and what is now South Sudan, and in building up South Sudan, that has in any other similar situation in Africa, perhaps ever. And so there's a lot at stake, not just the fate of South Sudan, but really U.S. engagement in this region and our credibility.
How do you see this going forward from here, Andrew?
I'm honestly curious to see what's going to happen. I'm not sure how you develop a coalition government after the split, because Machar does command a lot of respect throughout the country, how you bring him back into the government, if Kiir can retain power, or if there's a third-party leader that comes in that's able to bridge the gaps, the schisms that have developed. It'll be interesting to see, and I don't think there's any clear answer.
Do you think, Dr. Pham, even though both President Kiir and Dr. Machar so want power, that in the interest of the country, they may be willing to step down to a secondary role and let other members of their party take over?
Well, I'm going to be a little audacious in my response to that. I think that given the thing, whether this will happen or not is a different story, but given what has transpired in the last month, including the alleged coup and the spiraling out of control of the situation, I'm not sure that Salva Kiir is the right person to lead this step forward. I think he may be irreparably damaged. As for Riek Machar, he was not president, so he doesn't hold that responsibility. He wants to be president, but he has to run and be elected by the people if they choose to do so. And in order to do that, you can't grant him incumbency to do that. So he has to likewise step aside. I think the international community, the most viable, sustainable solution is brokering some sort of transition and then letting the people of South Sudan, for whom elections are scheduled in 2015, proceed to fair, credible elections and then let them decide their own fate.
So basically, there needs to be a transition government, you're saying, in 2014 that leads to the 2015 elections, or can elections be moved forward a little bit?
I think a lot depends on conditions on the ground, but I think there has to be some sort of transition, possibly with robust international supervision, the kind we've had in other places like Kosovo and other places, and then moving toward elections. Whether they can be realistically moved up, I think that's a technical question, but one whose answer is predicated on security and stability on the ground.
Okay, well, thank you so much both for coming and taking out time. I'm afraid that our time is up, but this is a very complicated situation, so we may visit it again. I'd really want to thank our guests, Dr. Peter Pham, the director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and Andrew Green, the Juba Bureau Chief of the South Sudan Project. And thank you for joining us. Please send us your questions or comments or watch our past shows on our website, voanews.com/ontheline. We look forward to hearing from you and hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of On the Line.